Hi and welcome back to Terry Talks Movies. 2023 has started, and it started kind of interestingly. We found out we've got possums in the backyard. Got some plans for the year which are going to be good, but let's get started with three science fiction movies, one from the 1930s, one from the 1960s, and one from 1974, which has been getting a lot of play in media right at this very moment. But first, Espresso. Espresso, the nectar of YouTubing. So I decided I wanted to do some older science fiction movies, and I know science fiction movies is something that the audience wants to see on this channel. So I decided to go way back. Everybody's doing the new stuff. Everybody's doing the Blue Smurfs. Sing a happy song. But I'm going back, way back to 1935. For a movie which is kind of bold, kind of interesting, and kind of derivative in a very strange way. It is a movie called The Tunnel from 1935, also known in America as the Transatlantic Tunnel. And it was directed by Morris Elvey, who did a few genre works. He did a movie in 1929 called High Treason, which was a pacifist movie about how rich munitions companies were playing people off against each other in order to make money and possibly generate a Second World War. Interesting little film. I watched that one too, but I'm not going to talk about it much today. The Tunnel is, as the American title suggests, about a project to create a transatlantic tunnel. It was based on Bernard Kellerman's 1913 novel, The Tunnel, and tells the story of a visionary genius called Richard McCallum, who, with his friend Robbie Robbins, played by Leslie Banks, McCallum is played by Richard Dix, the American actor, finds a way to dig a transatlantic tunnel to link the English-speaking nations of the world.
The proposition is the construction of an Atlantic tunnel between England and America.
Don't look into that too deeply, otherwise you're going to get down a very dark rabbit hole and see that there are certain racial aspects of it, let's say, which are kind of problematic in a modern context. But the movie basically is the story of the building of the tunnel, the impact on McCallum's family, his wife Ruth, and his son Jeffrey, played by Madge Evans and Jimmy Hanley respectively. It's a kind of saga. It's got transatlantic planes, it's got people doing Zoom calls between each other, it's got motorized wheelchairs, and it's got a fantastic production design and sets and miniatures made for the movie. Now, it wasn't actually made for the movie though. What they did was, 2 years before in 1933, there was a German version of this movie made called Der Tunnel, and they used the special effects from the 1933 German version in the 1935 English language version. The good special effects, I mean, Germany at the time was the special effects place, all the way from Metropolis and even before that onwards. If you wanted futuristic special effects and really effective miniatures, they were the guys to go to. And so reusing those special effects, which people in the English language movie-going audience hadn't seen, really lifted the production value of that film. And it's a good film. It's a lot of fun. Leslie Banks steals the movie from the very stolid and kind of lantern-jawed Richard Dix, playing Robbie, who's McCallum's best friend, as well as being a confidant to his wife Ruth. Now, Leslie Banks was an interesting actor. He had scarring on one side of his face from World War I, and he played two kinds of roles in movies. He was really good as the villain in The Most Dangerous Game. So what he did was, one side of his face would be towards the camera when he was playing sympathetic roles, and when he played villainous roles, the other side of his face was towards the camera. He was kind of like Two-Face before Harvey Dent got the gig, but he was a very fine English actor, and he's very personable playing Robbie. He gets the jokes, he gets to be a bridge between the family as things get strained between Ruth and Richard McCallum and their son Jeffrey. He's a kind of emotional bridge in this film. Now, it's very much of its time in some ways, where people go around in airplanes wearing jodhpurs. The gender roles are quite strictly enforced. But I kind of like it. I like the fact that it was bold in concept, even though, of course, the concept was originally in the German film, which was also done in a French version at the same time. So the 1933 was the French and German versions, 1935 was the English version. But from a modern viewpoint, it stands as a kind of period piece, of course. And sometimes the futures that movies of the past give us are really interesting to see the road not travelled in a sense. And I think that this one works family drama, and it is fairly solidly grounded for the time. And the characters matter as much as the spectacle. Too often, even in modern science fiction, spectacle is the king and the characters come very secondary, where in good narrative fiction of any kind, characters are more important than spectacle. Now, there's some interesting side bits in this too. The English Prime Minister is played by George Arliss, who had a career playing statesman-like characters. He did a very good film playing Benjamin Disraeli, the 19th century English Prime Minister. And to play the American president, you've got Walter Houston, John Huston's father, Angelica Houston's grandfather. And Walter Houston played US president before, most notably in Gabriel Over the White House in 1933, which is a nicely satirical little political drama of the time. And at the time he was very hot too. Did a fantastic drama called Dodsworth, of which I've got a lot of fondness. But he gets to play the US president. They're basically there for cameos to do speeches about how wonderful the transatlantic tunnel is and how it's going to bring all the English-speaking nations of the world together and all that kind of thing. They get to do the heavy lifting on those didactic aspects of the film. But it looks good. The drama works. It's of its time, but it feels like they were reaching towards something that never really happened in cinema. World War II happened, and I think that arc we were starting to get in the 1930s of interesting science fiction films went by the wayside for a number of years until the post-war period, when science fiction became something very different based on the historic events of World War II. But The Tunnel is definitely worth checking out. It's an interesting piece of historic science fiction. It's honest science fiction, and it's kind of groovy. I like the production design. I like the Art Deco come futuristic look of it. And for me, it just worked. So that's the first of the three films. So the second of the films we've got for you, you've probably seen. It's a 1962 British film called The Day of the Triffids, based on John Wyndham's novel. It stars Howard Keel, Nicole Morey, Janet Scott, and Kieran Moore. And yes, it does get a reference in the lyrics of science fiction double feature from Rocky Horror Picture Show. Wyndham's science fiction was always considered cosy catastrophes, global catastrophes that occurred in the home counties in the bottom part of England. And this one stretches things a little bit further. The protagonists travel as far as France and Spain, but the original novel, they don't get any further than the Isle of Wight. For reasons, we all know the setup. A meteor shower occurs all over the world, giving bright flashing lights to the sky, and everybody goes out and watches them.
All reports confirm that the world is witnessing an unprecedented shower of meteorites.
And the meteor shower also brings the seeds of a plant called a Triffid. It's tall, it has a whip-like appendage which can deal out poisonous lacerations, and it can move. Unbeknownst to the human race, the meteor shower also blinds everybody who sees it. So most of the human race is blind, and suddenly there are these nasty carnivorous plants which can move, travelling around the countryside. Not too sure how much they would have travelled around places like Saudi Arabia, where plants don't tend to do too well in sand, but that is one of the reasons why the novel and the movie are pretty much set in temperate climates. Get Howard Keel, whose career the previous decade was mostly baritone singing roles in films I really like Kismet, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and Kiss Me Kate, of course. But in this one, he's playing a sailor called Bill Mason, who is blinded in an industrial accident. He has an operation, but he has bandages over his eyes, which fortunately for him aren't to be taken off until the next morning after all of the fireworks have stopped. Bill wakes up, finds out that it's later than he thinks and that there's nobody come to take his bandages off. And he eventually finds out that everybody in London, where he is blind. This, of course, parallels Cillian Murphy's experiences in 28 Days Later. And The Day of the Triffids was used as a template for that part of that particular movie. We do get to see a lot of London in the chaos of suddenly people being blind. We get aeroplane crashes, we get train smashes, we get desperate people trying to grab anyone who could see to help them survive. That chaos is done really well in a fairly short group of scenes, establishing the catastrophe that's occurred. Bill also finds a young girl called Susan, played by Janina Fay, who he rescues and takes across the English Channel because London is basically burning. Everything's going to hell. London isn't a nice place to be, not to mention the fact that the Triffids are there. He takes her across the English Channel because they've heard something on the radio on his ship, which says that there's some kind of an establishment in France. And they go on this picaresque journey through France where they meet a whole bunch of people in a institute for the blind. Some of the people are still sighted and they're helping the other people. But eventually it gets to the stage where it's not really viable to help the people who have that disability because of the Triffids and because of the dangers and because of a whole bunch of French prisoners who escape from their prison and ravage the women in this particular establishment. So Bill, Susan, and a woman called Christine, played by Nicole Morey, who you might remember was the love interest to Charlton Heston in The Secret of the Incas, travel to Spain and try to establish contact with the British Navy, some of whom are still doing okay, and who are evacuating people to a safe place. So, of course, this is a movie from the 1960s, and it didn't have a tremendously large budget. So the evocation of the catastrophes is done really well, given the budget, but it still looks kind of fake, but acceptable to a 1960s audience. Problem is that the back end of the film and the interstitial parts of the film don't work. There are inserts filmed by Freddie Francis and not the director Steve Sekeli, of a pair of scientists trapped on a lighthouse off the coast of Cornwall, played by Kieran Moore and Janet Scott, who are trying to investigate how to get rid of Triffids. So there's lots of Triffid invasions of the lighthouse, there's lots of screaming by Janet Scott, there's lots of drunken raving by Kieran Moore, and so they finally find out by accident that the way to kill Triffids is seawater. It's a real fudge of a Deus Ex Machina ending to placate the audience, and it sucks. In the original novel, the humans take refuge on the Isle of Wight, which they can clear of Triffids because it's an enclosed space, of course. And they try to rebuild civilization. They vow to retake their land. There was a sequel to Day of the Triffids written about 15 years ago. Not written by John Wyndham, but written by another writer, which continues the story of the characters, but it doesn't really work that well from what I understand. People kind of liked it because they wanted more of the story. And there were a couple of TV miniseries of Day of the Triffids as well, one in the 1980s and one in about 2009. The original one is the one that stayed in people's memory, the one from 1962. It's kind of okay if you saw it when you were a kid, and it was on TV a lot in that certain period between the 1960s and the 1990s when everybody started getting VHS tapes. And so it's the one people have a kind of emotional connection to and a fondness for. And it kind of works well in the same way that all of those British horror / science fiction movies of the early 60s work. They've got some interesting character actors. We get Mervyn Johns in this one and a bunch of other people as well. So good supporting casts, really trying hard with the resources available to convey things that didn't exist in the real world. And the drama just kind of works right up until that Deus Ex Machina ending, which was tacked on for reasons known only to the producers of the film. I like it, but I don't like it as much as I want to like it, if you know what I mean. I think that ending really does sour it for me. So the third one I'm doing, because there's a meme going around about this movie, Zardoz. And the meme is total bullshit. There's a meme saying that Zardoz is set in the year 2023 and that we all should be dressing like Sean Connery in the thigh boots and the jockstrap. A couple of things wrong with that. First off, good luck doing that in the Northern Hemisphere right now. Secondly, the titles of the movies tell you that it was directed by John Borman and it is set in the year 2293. It's one of those stupid memes that people put out because they get drunk or hyped up on Red Bull and start playing around with Photoshop. But I thought it was a good opportunity to take another look at Zardoz. Now, as our friend Tim Leby, who turns up on the chat a lot and also turns up in the comments on the channel, reminded me, I reviewed this on my podcast many moons ago and called it a dog's breakfast. It was bits and pieces of everything chucked in together. And to a certain extent, I stand by that evaluation of it. I rewatched it yesterday and I found out some interesting things about it. First off, the movie has an introduction that breaks the fourth wall. There's a narration right at the start by Arthur Frayne, the person who is Zardoz, giving us some background on the world that John Boorman, who was the writer and director, created for this particular movie. And I'm not sure that serves us well. I think that going into the movie and finding things out bit by bit is a much more interesting way of approaching this kind of material, but it was the 1970s, and science fiction wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now, and so they took the safe option and had a narration at the start. Of course, we get Zed, one of the exterminators, played by Sean Connery, who is a brute who's socially engineered by Arthur Frayne, playing Zardoz, the giant stone head god, keeps the population outside the barrier of the vortex under control. He's been socially engineered and genetically manipulated to be a kind of incels would call an alpha male. He runs around on horseback with guns given to him by Zardoz to keep the population under control. Yeah, he's brutal, but he's also, as the story progresses, a kind of Ubermensch, a Superman. Now, the vortex is interesting. It's a force field around a whole bunch of different areas around, if not the world, then in the UK at least. Again, this is almost a cozy catastrophe, where immortal people live in supposed harmony and who are known as the Eternals. The Eternals are telepathic. They can weaponize this telepathy. They can control the minds of lesser beings, and they can communicate between themselves, all mediated by the tabernacle. There's a few problems with the Eternals. First off, they're immortal, but they find immortality problematic several hundred years after acquiring it. There are a whole bunch of different groups of the Eternals. There are the apathetics, who are in a kind of catatonic trance and who wander around and who are fed by the other Eternals. And there are also a group called the Renegades, who are basically aged people who are kept alive but who are senile and immortal. Now, the punishment for transgressions in the vortex are aging. Do something wrong, they'll chuck a couple of years onto your age, and you'll slowly age until you become one of the renegades and you live in a kind of ballroom gazebo, dancing around and dribbling. It's a harsh world, whichever side of you on. You're either outside with the brutals or you're inside with the Eternals, and everything you do that isn't part of the consensus of these telepathic beings gets you aged. So, yeah, there are metaphors there, but I'm not going to really bother with them. The movie is weird, and I'll be honest with you about that. The production design is fantastic. The look of everything is fantastic. The fact that they're shot on old farm estates with enormous plastic bubbles attached to them to give them a kind of combination of bucolic and futuristic looks. There are some really interesting things done with mirrors and projections, which make things kind of fun. The Eternals don't really spell very well. They spell about as well as an online right-wing nut job on Twitter. It builds its own world, and the revelation of the world building is interesting. Still, it doesn't really seem cohesive to me. Now, I like the fact that there are the apathetics there, and they're basically innocents who just can't handle being immortal. I don't like the Eternals themselves. I think they're boring in a way. There is an outlier in the Eternals, a guy called Friend, played by John Alderson, who tries to help Zed and is against the peer pressure culture of the Eternal. There's an enemy in the Eternals for Zed, Consuela, played by Charlotte Rampling, who, like the rest of the Eternals, is non-sexual. They kind of lose their sex drive because of their immortality. But Zed, being a kind of studly male, reawakens the sexuality in the female population of the Eternals In a sense, this movie is a crazy male fantasy. And the resolution of the plot as things progress and as the world of the Eternals and the Vortex decomposes, there are some kind of male fantasy aspects to that which are a little bit on the nose in a modern context. Sean Connery, of course, plays Zed. And Sean Connery is not at his best here because I'm not sure he particularly understood the role. It's not his best work at the time, and it's not even his best work of any time. He was an actor who was intelligent. He could play a wide range of roles and was sometimes miscast. But as Zed, he's okay except for the emotional revelation parts of the character. Originally, John Boorman wanted to do this movie with Burt Reynolds, with whom he'd worked on Deliverance. But Burt Reynolds was unwell, wasn't able to do it, so they got Sean Connery along. Sean Connery was in a bit of a career slump, so John Boorman got him fairly cheaply. Yeah, I'm not sure Connery was quite right for it. I'm not even sure Burt Reynolds would have been right for the role. And there are moments where Sean Connery's acting is kind of laughable. His emotional changes as he finds things out as the character of Zed. That tonal shift sometimes is done quite poorly. Like a lot of science fiction movies at the time, it was about people finding dystopias and breaking them. Logan's Run was the same way. A Boy and His Dog was the same way. You know, a stranger comes into a supposedly utopian community and just breaks shit up because it's bad. This is very much in the tone of that kind of science fiction of the time. The ending is kind of weird. I'll do the spoilers, so if you don't want spoilers on a movie that's old enough to be your brother. Zed knocks up a whole bunch of the Eternal women and sends them off to found a new society somewhere. He then settles down in the broken head of Zardoz with Charlotte Rampling as Consuela. There's a weird montage where they have a kid, the kid grows up and nicks off and they die. And the interesting thing about that part is none of them look happy about it. Zed doesn't look happy, Consuela doesn't look happy, the kid doesn't look happy in that montage. It's a weird ending. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's a bit of a dog's breakfast. I think that the initial world building and the origin of the Vortex and all the things that happen there is kind of interesting. But I'm not sure that John Boorman knew how to stick the landing. And that's the problem I have with the film. But having said that, people like it, and some people like it a lot more than I do. It's interesting, and the visuals are quite striking, and I like the visuals in it. And I like maybe 60% of it.
Nasty substances.
But the rest of it's deeply ill-considered. There are a lot of science fiction movies of the time that I only like 60% of. I'm quite critical of the storytelling when it fails. The three movies are all interesting in their own way. They're all flawed in particular different ways. Though I think The Tunnel is the least flawed of them, oddly enough. It was fun revisiting them. It was fun to start the year with a couple of them, which I enjoyed as well. And I think I'm going to do more of this kind of stuff in future on the channel because I think it works. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the notification bell so you know the next time I talk at the camera. You can also support the channel financially for only a few bucks by going to patreon.com/PaleoCinema. I'm doing more video giveaways for the Patreon subscribers in January and possibly into early February. So stick around for that. In the meantime, hope 2023 is fantastic for you and that it shits miracles and pisses wonders. Watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some old science fiction movies with a critical eye. And I'll catch you next time.